Funny story, I've been super nervous all day, and a friend of mine gave me the advice that I should come up on stage and beatbox for a minute, and that would make me less nervous. I'm actually not going to do that, but I found that telling a story to make someone laugh makes them a lot less nervous, and I think that happens to be true. So, just a forewarning. Fantastic. Just a forewarning, there are a lot of opinions in this slide deck, and if you'd like to talk to me about those opinions, I will be hopefully in a light-up dress at the party, like broadcasting myself as much as possible. So feel free to approach me and talk to me about these things, because they are important. So, JavaScript, especially, but programming in general, but I'm finding JavaScript is falling more and more into a fanaticism problem. We invest in one framework, one tool, one way of coding, and we use it for everything and anything. And we're actually starting to see alternatives to our way of doing things as adversaries rather than alternatives, rather than ways to benefit our lives and our code. I definitely see a lot of the when you have a hammer, everything's a nail problem. We use our favorite tools even when they might not necessarily fit well, or maybe something would be a little bit better or a little bit easier to use. Not just for ourselves, but when we're working on teams, we tend to pick our favorite tools maybe at the expense of those we're working with. And I truly believe fanaticism prevents us from building the best software we can possibly build. We're limiting ourselves to singular frameworks, singular tools, and we're missing out on all the possibilities that are there. I'm not saying we should learn everything. I'm saying we should keep our minds open. It's not just that we miss new tools to hold on to what we already know. The new and shiny effect is something I see very pervasively in JS. I saw this a lot with Grunt when Gulp came out. A lot of people immediately jumped to Gulp and just started trashing Grunt, and it was quite confusing to me to see two perfectly valid tools, but because one was newer, it must have been better. I didn't quite see it. So, if you need an example of this kind of fanaticism, there's nothing like waking up the morning of your talk to a blog post saying that the premise of your talk is bunk. I was absolutely dumbfounded this morning when I saw a blog post about it. And I definitely like Isaac's response to this, and I hate to read off my slides, but I'm going to read this. There's this myth that a single rule or the rejection of one will make software development simple or easy, and that's bull. And I happen to really agree with that. So today I'm really here to talk about modular architecture, but keep what I've already said in mind. Keep the problems of fanaticism in mind when I talk about this, because it will come up from time to time. So one of the things that I find for modular architecture is, I get this question a lot. I've spoken about Flight, which is a front-end framework from Twitter, and I get this question all the time when I speak about that framework, and I find it's a valid question, but asking how is Flight like Ember, how is Flight like Angular, how is Flight like Polymer, which Polymer isn't even really, comparing, it should not be the basis for selecting a framework or a tool. We shouldn't be asking ourselves, how are things like each other in the JavaScript ecosystem? We should be asking, how will this tool, this framework, this piece of code make my life better as a developer, make my team's life better, make my process better? These are the kinds of questions I find we're not asking nearly as much, but we could be and we should be. And before I say, before I get the argument of, oh, well, that means we just shouldn't become attached to anything, that's entirely not true. We should definitely be passionate about the tools we use. Blog posts, documentation, pull requests, tests, these are all things we could be doing to show our passion for the tools that we like to use now. We just need to apply some critical thinking as a group, and I'm sure not all of you fall for this, but I have. I've caught myself doing this recently. So we need to remember to be passionate but not a fanatic about the tools that we use, the frameworks that we use. We need to keep open minds. Another problem I see is common developer assumptions. jQuery. I love jQuery. I really do. I consider it to be a common developer assumption that it requires some thought. Before you start your next application, think about what you're going to use. And don't just assume that because you've always used a particular tool that it needs to be in place. And I'm certainly not saying don't use a framework ever. I like frameworks. I'm particular, I like quite a few different frameworks for different tasks. So I'm definitely not saying don't ever use a framework. I'm simply saying we should be much more judicious about when and what frameworks we happen to use. I like to consider the following when I'm considering any tool, but especially tools that require a large amount of buy-in. Is it bringing in functionality I don't need? Can I bring in outside code easily? This is one of the more important ones. And one of the ones that I feel, especially with teams, is what's the investment to reward ratio? How much work am I going to have to put in to learn this particular tool in order to get what I need out of it? One way to kind of help determine what kind of tools, I definitely am a big fan of building proofs of concepts. Like to do MVC, definitely a good way of seeing how to build a tool. Write more than the hello world with whatever tool you're happening to proof of concept. I see this a lot and I've done it, where I've written a hello world in a tool and I've just dismissed it based off that. You're going to want to actually get your hands dirty with whatever tool you're evaluating before you make any decisions about it, positive or negative. Make sure you're just building a proof of concept for the tool you're trying to evaluate. If you bring in 3 different tools and try to use them together and it turns out to be horrible, maybe one of those tools or all 3 of those tools are actually fantastic. It's just using them together was a pain. So definitely try to isolate your proof of concept to kind of actually evaluate the tool at hand. And keep your team's eccentricities in mind. This is especially important when you're not working by yourself. I've gotten into an argument with my coworkers about semicolons for 2 hours. You have to keep other people's development in mind because it will make your life better if they're happier. So I usually get to this point in the conversation with people before actually starts to pop up an awful lot. So what I'm going to do is go over the 3 most common arguments I hear against using a modular architecture and building from the ground up, and kind of counterpoint or even admit to the possible downfalls of this sort of building. The first one I get is that module systems cause spaghetti code. Cobbling all these little tiny pieces of code together causes an completely unmaintainable application, and it's just impossible to understand how everything's working together. And the worst part is no one's code is the same style, so you're writing different styles of code around your application. The counter to this would be a framework would solve this by including everything or having a plugin system, some sort of unified language or way of doing things. My response to that is we should be separating our module choices from our code in our frameworks from our business logic. We shouldn't be tightly coupling these either way, whether we're using a framework or whether we're using a modular structure. I do believe in the practical use of abstraction layers. I used to scoff at them just as much as some of my friends and some of my respected peers, but I actually believe abstraction layers, when used in proper settings, are quite beneficial. Functional mixins, as opposed to inheritance, I've also found is a very valid tactic for keeping code separated and keeping it loosely coupled while being able to use the functionality within that code. And then architecture assistance. I'm going to talk a little more about how I really feel about frameworks and where my thoughts come from on that. So with abstraction layers, I find a really good example of this is Primus. If you've ever used it for Node, it's a WebSocket abstraction layer for different protocols. And if you want to use different protocols for your WebSockets, all you have to do is change one line of configuration. It gives the standard API to all of the WebSocket configurations. So that way, if you need to switch, if you need to make a technology change, and you don't have to rewrite your entire application, you just change one line. I think this is definitely something we can consider for pieces of functionality. Creating an abstraction layer, if we're using third-party code, creating that layer of the things we need. I also find writing the abstraction layer before choosing your module can actually help you make the decision quite well. You say, okay, I need these things out of my query selectors. I need out of my animation tool. I need these things. When you have the API that you need, it makes it a little easier to select the tool that you want and the tool that will do what you need it to do. As for functional mixins, I can't really go into the details of how they work because that would be a whole nother talk. Angus Kroll has written a lot about these, and I find that they fit JavaScript as a language quite well. And it's a very interesting way to augment your code with other code's functionality without necessarily tightly coupling that code. As for architecture assistance, I do mean frameworks in this sense. And I usually fall back to the definition of the word framework when I'm considering that. And the definition of the word is an essential supporting structure, the basic structure. And a lot of frameworks out there do everything, and that's cool. I really only care about the part where they're providing a structure for my code. The rest of the stuff can be evaluated separately. And the other thing I like to consider when I'm thinking of the definition of the word is a framework giving me structure, or is it giving me a gilded cage from which if I want to do something outside of the ways of the framework, am I going to have to fight it? I've seen, and I've been on teams that have fought their framework endlessly, and instead of considering dropping the framework for a modular sort of architecture, they'd spend even more time than rebuilding the application fighting that framework. Some good examples of frameworks that provide architecture assistance and not much else include Flight and Backbone for the front end and Restify for the back end. Though Restify is starting to kind of branch out into more functionality, I think generally it does provide that architecture assistance if you're doing a REST API. If you're doing a web app, not a, definitely, like I said, be judicious about what frameworks you use and when. So what you get with keeping your code, your business logic separate from your modules is you can swap out your modules with minimal work. You need to write it to the abstraction layer, and that's it. You don't need to worry about every particular piece of code that's calling that module because you've used that tertiary layer. And especially for testing, you can test through your abstraction layer and you're done. When you swap out a module, you don't usually need to rewrite your test. Sometimes there may be extenuating circumstances, but to the general point, when you do it this way, you can swap out modules, swap out even technologies without worrying about rewriting your entire test suite, without worrying about rewriting most of your code. So the second argument I get a lot is that my framework has everything my team needs. I don't need outside sources. I don't need to worry about looking at 50 different tools and picking one. My framework does this for me, and it's got my best interests in mind, and et cetera. And that's definitely a good point. I mean, frameworks can do a lot for you, especially if you align with what the framework is concerned about. And basically, developer efficiency is something that is brought up a lot. My team writes faster when I'm in a framework because everything's there. You can learn the framework, and then you're done. You've got all the knowledge you need to build web applications from that framework. And this is definitely the argument where I see fanaticism really start to leak through. I have given 2 talks about Flight at conferences, and the same thing has happened both times. I immediately sit down, and someone runs over to me with a laptop and shows me my sample code, rewritten in another framework. I ask them how long it took. One said 5 minutes, and one said 10 minutes. So I think to myself, if you came running over the second I sat down, you missed the last 5 or 10 minutes of my talk about another framework to prove me wrong by writing it in your framework. This is my response to them just about every time. Because I just feel like that's great. That's great for you that you know your framework that well. That's great that your framework is that efficient. And you really showed me, but you missed my point. You missed an entirely new opportunity in a new tool and a new way of thinking about things because you were mired in what your favorite already was. All-in-one frameworks, to me, they have a lot of buy-in, and that makes me wary. I have a personal metric. I'm sure someone else has thought of it before me. I call it the time to first hello world metric and the time to first non-trivial. And those are both rather high for a lot of the all-in-one frameworks that I've experimented with. Not just for myself, but I've asked around, and other people have seemed to have high time to first worlds and high non-trivial times. And that, to me, it leaves devs in the dark for a lot longer. So when you talk about dev efficiency, it's about whether they need to learn things in increments or whether they need to learn all about a framework at once and then they're done. So you're not putting, one isn't easier than the other, I think. I think it's both the same amount of work. It's just in what increments you put those work in. Finally, when it comes to picking a framework versus picking modules, I feel sometimes that when you're talking about frameworks, it feels kind of like a negotiation of, oh, well, this framework does this, this, and this well, but we have to put up with these two things that don't go well with our app. Or you fight the app so that, or you fight the framework or whatever you're using so that you can accomplish those two things decently, but how much time did you put into that? Definitely, to me, it feels like you're kind of holding pieces of your application as like bartering tools. It's like, okay, if we can get A, B, and C out of this framework, we can put up with D and E being like terrible to implement. The last argument is, well, was the most solid argument, but I think now it's actually kind of a moot point. I really think third-party module management has come a long, long way in JavaScript since when I started JavaScript development. And my favorite joke about this is we have the technology. We have ways of managing module upgrades, versioning, installing dev environments quickly and easily. We have, they're not, of course, they're not perfect, but I certainly think we have these to a workable state. Of course, I'm talking about NPM, and feelings aside about Bower, it is a package management tool, and it does its job. So feelings aside, those two tools have really stepped forward in terms of managing third-party modules, in terms of keeping versioning sane, in terms of keeping your application structured, and in terms of what code goes where and what version it is. And as for module loading in the browser, again, we have a litany of tools that meet a litany of needs, and ES6 is coming, and that has module loading natively, which is fantastic, I think. So with these combined, and with continuous integration tools such as Travis CI that sort of manage and alert you when you have a dependency that's fallen out of version, or when you can run your tests quickly and you can run your configurations quickly, I think there's a significant reduction in nightmares. There will always be nightmares with managing third-party modules. I won't deny that. There will always be a reason to worry about it, but I think we've significantly reduced that worry over the past few years. So, to reiterate, be passionate but not fanatic about the tools that you use. Definitely be a little more judicious and skeptical of tools with a large amount of buy-in. I'm not saying don't use them. I'm simply saying evaluate them to the fullest and then consider your needs, all of your needs, not just some of your needs. Pick the right tool for each task. And like I said, if you use a framework, be judicious. Now, why bother with all this? Some of you may be out there and still feel that modular architecture is still a pain. It's still more difficult than framework. What do you get out of it? Abstractions for me and my team create a common language and a common way of doing things so that all the developers can still speak the same language, even though we've got several pieces of third-party code. Everything you need and nothing you don't, and nothing really getting in your way that you didn't need in the first place. And testing. When you have self-contained modules, it's much easier to test. I've found testing against an application built on a framework, I end up testing the framework more than I end up testing my own application code. With a modular setup, you're much more likely to, you can see your code in smaller bits, and it's easier to see, okay, what's my code and what's the module I'm using, and test, therefore. Because I've been saying this a lot, and this developer happiness is contagious. When you're happy, your team's happy, and when you're all developing code that is easier to maintain and easier to keep track of, everyone's happier. I have a couple of thank yous to make. Chris Williams and the JSConf staff for putting on such an amazing conference. I've had a miraculously fun time. I'd really like to thank Retail Me Not. I'm an engineering evangelist for them. They let me speak at conferences, and they fly me all over the place, and they let me have these fun experiences. And I'd like to thank my friend and mentor, Ray. I often say I don't know where I'd be without him, but I do know that my life is better for him in it. Thank you for listening. Like I said, if you have questions or comments, feel free to track me down at tonight's party. I should be wearing a light-up dress. That's my Twitter handle, my email address, and again, I'm an engineering evangelist at Retail Me Not. Thank you very much for listening.